considered unclean. God tells Peter to kill and eat those animals. Like, no, Lord, I've never done that, right? Because I've always obeyed the scriptures. I've always done what you've asked me to do. And then God says, don't call something unclean that I have called clean. And Achtemeyer invites to consider, what if we treated LGBT people with a similar grace that God asks Peter to treat Gentiles in Acts chapter 10? Because God is continually confounding our expectations and, in very interesting ways, seemingly overturning scriptures. It happens all over the New Testament and the Old Testament, where God says, here's my revealed will, and here's how I'm going to show you that I'm going to fulfill that in a way that appears to completely contradict, overturn what I have already said. So we should, as we read the scriptures, expect that God is going to bless unconventional people and unconventional ways of fulfilling God's plan, because that seems to be the only way that God does it throughout the scriptures. Let's get to the Hebrew Bible, and I want to spend the rest of our time on that. Old Testament. Making sense of the fragments. So we are trying in this class to not follow the fragment method, to take one little passage here and there to build our entire theology, but we also can't ignore the scriptures that seem to talk about same-sex behavior. So the first one we have to talk about is Genesis 19. This is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Anybody remember the story? Give us like a little, summary of what this one's about. Those of you who went to the class that my brother put on a couple months ago, he brought us very slowly through the previous chapter, Genesis 18. And in Genesis 18, God hears about the evil acts of Sodom and sends two angels to go check things out. And so on their way to Sodom, these two angels run into Abraham and Sarah, and that was the story that we looked at, where Abraham goes and he and Sarah together make this big meal for them and treat them with this lavish hospitality. And then through that encounter with these two messengers from God, these two angels from God, it's revealed that Sarah's going to have a child. And she laughs about it. And that was where we left off the story with Nathan. What happens then is these two angels go on to Sodom. And they go there and they come to the town square and they meet Lot. You remember who Lot is? Abraham's what? It's his nephew. And so Lot meets them in the town square, and what does he say to these two strangers? He doesn't know they're angels, by the way.
He takes them in.
Yeah. He says, come, stay, right? It's not safe out here. Better come with me. And so Lot, again, shows hospitality to these strangers, just like Uncle Abraham did to them when in the previous chapter. So Lot brings them into his home, and then the men of Sodom surround the home, and they say, bring out those men because we want to have sex with them. And Lot says, no, we can't do this. And then in a way that also we're like, yeah, good job, Lot. But then he says, but you can have my daughters instead. Yikes. Who is, exactly. But what we see is that the story of Sodom is a story it's all about that theme of hospitality. And so Lot is living in this place, and he knows that they don't like outsiders here, and they're going to show that by trying to rape my guests. And I think the angels blind the men of Sodom, and they all get away except for Lot's wife, who ends up turned to salt. Another bummer part of the story. But God has heard of this great sin, and so what the church has done oftentimes is said, what is the sin of Sodom? He said the sin of Sodom is that they wanted to have sex with men, right? Men wanted to have sex with men. That's the way the church has often taught this passage. Where does the logic break down within the story itself, if that's the great sin of Sodom? Lot offers his daughters. It's not about the gender of the guests, is it? It has nothing to do with, we're men, these are men, and we're going to have sex together. And by the way, it's also not sex, is it? It's rape.
That's what spouse.
Yes.
It's not, love and intimacy.
Nope. No. And so this story that we have used to say, here's why being gay is a sin, I think we can see is deeply offensive to say that, right? Because this story of Sodom and Gomorrah is about gang rape. It has nothing to do with two people who want intimacy with one another, which is rape is always about power, right? It's not about intimacy. And so in the same way that, I won't go down that example, but Achtemeyer says, and I think we can all affirm, what this story is condemning, we all agree with, bad, right? We're not looking at the sin of Sodom, but boy, that's okay, everything they're doing. No, of course not. We condemn with Genesis 19 that treating outsiders by violently coercing them sexually or otherwise is a sin. So we condemn with the Bible the sin of Sodom. And we say this has nothing to do with people of the same gender saying, I want to commit myself to another person in love and intimacy. And to equate one with the other is, I think we see how deeply offensive that would be, right? Because what on earth does this have to do with me wanting to share my life with another person? So the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it does show up in Scripture, it comes up again and again, and it's repeated again and again. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was their inhospitality, their greed, and the way they mistreated outsiders. It's not because a man was seeking to have sex with another man. And so it's simply looking and saying, this thing has nothing to do with what we're seeing today, right? Does that make sense? Do you have questions about Sodom and Gomorrah? But you've heard, and I'm sure some of you have heard the term sodomite, right?
Yes.
Which also deeply offensive term, and we should stop, not use that word except you should not use that word in any way to describe people of the same sex having intimacy with each other, because that's not what the sin of Sodom is about. So another very interesting story in Judges 19, interesting, horrific. These are both horror stories, right? Judges 19 is like a very parallel story to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Only this time you have another person who's going into a town he hasn't been to before, and the people of the town surround and say, we want to have sex with your, in this case, female concubine. And sadly, in the story of Judges 19, this priest says, okay, just don't hurt me. And so this group of people gang rapes this woman in Judges 19. And the parallels between them are almost identical except for one thing, which is the gender, right? In Sodom and Gomorrah, the visitors appear to be male. In Judges 19, it's a woman. And the reason you want to point these two out is because just like in Genesis 19, we condemn the gang rape there, we do the same thing in Judges 19, and we recognize that neither case has anything to do with love and intimacy. And it would be just as foolish as it would be to say, hey, the Sodom and Gomorrah story means that two people of the same gender can never have love and intimacy with one another. If we're going to apply that logic, we should do the same thing with Judges 19 and say, oh, see, two heterosexual people can never be committed to one another in a relationship of love and intimacy because remember Judges 19? You go, wait, what on earth does that have to do? One thing doesn't have to do with the other, right? Exactly. So that's why we want to point out the similarities between these because each one are things that we can wholeheartedly stand. We're not looking at these stories and going, you know what, we don't need to obey the scriptures anymore. No, we do, right? We stand with these scriptures and condemn sexual coercion in all of its forms.
Yeah.
Yes?
But as a concubine, wasn't she already being raped by her partner, owner?
Good question. Yeah, and so we also see that, a concubine, there's all kinds of examples in the scriptures of sexual ethics that were okay, seemingly, apparently, or at least were part of the culture at the time that we don't affirm anymore, right? And so having women have agency, voice, and autonomy over their own bodies was not something that took place in the ancient world with any kind of uniformity. And so, yeah, we condemn that part of the story as well. Yeah, absolutely. So back to where it says, the Bible rightly views the heterosexual gang rape carried out by the men of Gibeah as a terrible crime. Does this imply negative judgment against all forms of heterosexual activity, including faithful marriages? Obviously, no. So just as foolish as it would be to look at Judges 19 and say, this means that all heterosexual marriages are sin, that's how foolish it would be to look at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and do the same thing with gay people. The two big ones then, and this is it. So you think of the entire Bible, all the verses that exist in the Old Testament. This is it. Genesis 19, Leviticus 18, and Leviticus 20:13. These are the only passages in the Hebrew Scriptures that address, or seemingly address, people of the same gender being physically intimate with one another. So we don't have a mountain of evidence, right? We don't have like, oh, look at all of these scriptures that are piled up that we need to address. Certainly not in the Old Testament. And so Leviticus 18 and 20:13, I printed them out for you. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Now, let me ask you, when you hear the word abomination, what does that word mean to you? Bad thing. Something really awful, something that might, turn your stomach? Does the word abomination, when you use it, does that sound like a word that you would apply to something that is only like of cross-cultural, might be okay in one culture but not in another?
It's really unnatural.
Yeah.
It defies a natural law.
Yes, defies a natural law. So I think abomination is a terrible translation of this word, both in these verses but also everywhere else in the Hebrew Scriptures, because to us, the English word means something unnatural, something that turns your stomach, something that is like fundamentally and always wrong. Like we'd want to say, oh, I don't know, the gang rapes, right? Fundamentally and always wrong in every culture, what took place in Genesis 19 and Judges 19. But that's not what this word in Hebrew means. To us, it implies something subhuman or disgusting. But interestingly, this word is really not about morality. It's about cultural identity. That's what it is. And so, Exodus chapter 8, Moses is trying to get the people of Israel out of Egypt, and he goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go. We need to go make our sacrifices in the wilderness, because if we do it here in Egypt, it'll be an abomination to you Egyptians. Oh, an abomination. Yeah, it's that same word, to'avah. And so, when Moses says that, we would never go, oh, see, because they're going to go make sacrifices in the wilderness that make God sick. No, it's a cultural identity marker. And we see that at the end of Genesis as well, when Joseph has gone down to Egypt and he's getting ready to save everybody. And but he can't eat with, at the time, they're his brothers, but they don't, no one knows. His brothers don't know that yet. And he doesn't eat with them, because for an Egyptian to eat with Hebrew would have been an abomination. And so even actions that are right in God's sight, such as, sacrificing in the wilderness, the way that Moses is talking about, these can be called abominations because it was a culturally relative term within the scriptures themselves. Yes?
And, these were Jewish scriptures.
Yep.
And it would be correct, from that perspective, in my mind, correct?
Yes.
The idea that it's a cultural identity marker,
Yes.
and that it's really bad.
Yes. But some of them, it would be really bad, but not necessarily immoral. It may not be considered, like in the way, it's not immoral, obviously, for the Israelites to sacrifice to their God. What he's pointing out to Pharaoh is, this is going to offend you, let's do it. That's why you need to let us go do it over there. But it's not an offense to God, because these are cultural identity markers. And we kind of know this, right? If you look up Deuteronomy 14, it gives you a whole list of things that are an abomination in God's sight, including eating sheep, goats, and venison. Anybody like venison here? I love a good goat curry. I think goat curry is delicious. And here, Deuteronomy says, hey, that's an abomination. See, it was a culturally relative term for, at the time, it was a big concern in the Hebrew Scriptures that as Israel goes into the land, that they can't be like other nations. Now, we can think whether or not that was as important as they thought it was, but this is what they understood God was saying to them. We need to be different than the other people around us. And part of the way we express that difference is through what we eat, through how we worship, and a lot of it's about worship. So this word, abomination, I think is a bad translation in every place because it's so often referring to things that are culturally relative within the scriptures themselves. And that's not how we use that English word. So Achtemeyer goes to great length to talk about how in the Old Testament scriptures, there's a lot of references to temple prostitution. And this is apparently a practice that the Canaanites had, that the other nations around them had. And it may seem strange to us, and it probably is, but the way that people, I think, understood it is you go to the temple. Why? Because you needed God's blessing. You needed a blessing from the gods. And the primary blessing you needed if you lived in Canaan is for rain to fall from the sky. Because if rain doesn't fall from the sky, everybody dies. So this is what worship was primarily about in the Canaanite world, was the securing of God's blessing. It's the way they kind of thought about it was that if you would have sex in the temple, in their temple, this would inspire the gods to make the earth fertile as well. So the fertility act between a man and a woman in the temple was seen similarly as God being fertile with the earth. All very strange to us, but this is just kind of how they thought. And so having something that's unthinkable to us, having temple prostitutes was just part of the world in which they lived. And so we have all these verses again and again. 1 Kings 14:24, 15:12, 22:46, 2 Kings 23:7, and Deuteronomy 23:17. Achtemeyer notes all of these in your book. And so every time we see prostitution mentioned in the temple, it's considered a bad thing, whether it's with men or with women. And so it seems as though these two verses, Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, are referring to some form of temple prostitution that God in the Old Testament is saying, don't do that, right? You don't need to do that. I'm going to bless you. You don't need to have prostitution as part of your worship. And so Achtemeyer, I think rightly so, says if you were a male hearing these verses in the Old Testament, the only context you had for seeing gender sexuality was either a gang rape story from Genesis 19 or referring to some form of temple prostitution that is just apparently part of the Old Testament world around you. This is how you consider these things. And both of those, if those are the two contexts, we're going to say with Leviticus, yeah, we condemn those things too, right? We condemn the coercive gang rape of Genesis 19. And I'm so glad that we don't have prostitution as part of our worship on Sunday mornings. Right? I mean, but it's true. And so we're not saying these verses don't matter. We're saying that we need to understand them in terms of what they were actually condemning, as opposed to simply stripping them of all context and saying, oh, this must be what we have before us today. And so he writes, we do not take the Bible's condemnations of heterosexual temple prostitution and conclude from it that heterosexual marriage is ungodly. So the Bible's condemning temple prostitution, whatever the gender of people are involved, and we don't look at, the fact the Bible condemns that means that heterosexual marriage is therefore ungodly. Of course we don't do that. Why on earth would we think that such a leap made sense in the case of gay people? And so if this is what these verses are finally referring to and condemning, we don't then say, oh, because there was some form of same-gendered temple prostitution activity in the Old Testament that God is condemning, therefore all forms of intimacy between people of the same gender must be off the table. No. We condemn the thing that it condemns, and we don't have to generalize to everything else. And so let's get back to, as we look at this and as we close, all these things that are being condemned in these Old Testament passages, let's go back to Achtemeyer's definition of what marriage and love and intimacy are for. They're to help us grow in our ability to give completely ourselves to another person, following the pattern of Christ's self-giving love. And so, in all these coercive, demeaning practices that are being condemned, none of them would help another person give themselves to another, right, in self-giving love. And so we stand with them. We're not cutting them out of our Bibles. We're simply saying that what they are condemning, we too condemn, without then extrapolating to all cases and all people. My brain is scattered today. Sorry about that.
Oh, that was not scattered.
All right. Isn't it interesting that with all this is it? In your scriptures, there aren't others. Now we'll go to the New Testament next week. We'll need to spend more time. I'm going to dive more, particularly into Romans 1, because I think that's the most important passage in all of the Bible when it comes to this issue. So we're going to give it some really good time to dissect and think about. But it's kind of amazing when you actually look at, this is it. This is the whole case, right? And there's really not that much data that we need to do. Questions?
I have a question on the fragment method.
Yeah.
Or, I guess it's got me thinking, I mean, there's certain verses I sort of gravitate to, but I'm like, well, what am I doing? There's a fragment method there.
Yeah,
So I'm
yeah.
not necessarily making a broad condemnation on
Yep.
something, it's more inspirational. But it's got me thinking, am I looking at certain passages too lightly?
Yeah.
Is that passage, is that practice not helpful altogether?
Yeah.
I guess I'm questioning that a little bit.
It's a good question to ask, and I think that, what do you think about that before I answer?
I was struggling with the exact same thing.
Yeah, like Psalm
Thinking
46:10
about that.
is one of my, be still and know that I am God.
Exactly.
Can I go back? I couldn't tell you right now what the rest of that psalm is about.
Mm-hmm.
And so am I
Yeah.
latching onto something that really doesn't mean what I think it means?
Taking words that mean a lot to me as meditate words and things, and then not totally looking at the context because I don't think I have to, because those words are meaningful to me.
Yes.
Because cherry picking or arguments is not what I'm trying to do.
Right.
I'm
Right.
using it for meditation.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think there's great value in doing that. The question is our overarching story of what we think the scriptures is about, are we on the right track or the wrong track? And so if we're on the right track in our overall story, what we think the scriptures are leading us to, then having verses out of context here and there is probably not a bad thing. It might actually be just fine. So it is interesting, Psalm 46 is a great example. I'm not sure it means what we normally think it means, but we sure do need to be still. And we sure do need to remember that we're not God and God is God. And so I think that verse, as you kind of come to understand it and utilize it, there's value in doing both. Great, let's go back and look at Psalm 46 and put it in its context. But that doesn't mean that then we still can't hang on to that verse and say, but for my sake, I need to slow down because my mind is a monkey mind that bounces around. So when we have the overarching story right, I think we're in less danger of having the fragments do real damage because we've got the plot right. It's when we think the Bible is primarily a book of do's and don'ts, thou shalt nots, that we end up in a very condemning stance. We're the fragments that we pick. And if that's what the Bible primarily is, then of course we're going to find verses that reinforce what we already believe is true. But if we think the Bible is a book that is leading us towards a God of grace and mercy who invites us to be conduits of that grace to other people, I think we're in less danger of having those fragments do damage. So go for the context, it's great. But don't be fooled, that's the only thing, right? There's value in the small passage by itself, just as there's value in diving into the hard work. Other questions? All right, next week I'll be sharper. And we're going to dive deeper, particularly, I said, into Romans 1, because to me, that's where the kind of the whole ball game is. In terms of where we think the Bible is saying no to same-sex couples, that's where it all lies. And so we'll spend a good amount of time on there and give it the respect that it deserves. So let's pray. Lord, for all those who are sticking with us through this class, together here in the room, those who are joining us online, for all of us at this church called Covenant, and for the church at large, we want to be a people that receives this story of good news and embodies it for a world that's desperately in need of compassion and understanding, of love and belonging, intimacy, of love. So Lord, may this class be a way for us to not simply be receivers of your word, but conduits of it. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all.
What chapter should we be reading?
Great question. Thank you. So next week, we are going to spend our time primarily in chapter 7. Because I think we need to spend a good amount of time on what he calls the New Testament fragment. So yeah, just chapter 7 for next week. And then we'll probably finish up the following week with 8 and 9. Thank you all.